what makes Apocalypse unique? And then we started looking at the background and what the message of Revelation is. And we discovered that Revelation is profoundly hopeful, very different from the way that Apocalypse is perceived in the world out there, which is all about doom and gloom. Ultimately, Revelation offers us incredible hope and is really a fitting conclusion to the New Testament canon. This morning, we are going to look at a few issues of interpretation. First, I just want to show you on the screen a file that I have shared with you guys on Classroom. It might not appear yet. It will appear in the course of the day. It's something I shared with you yesterday. It's a little one page that I put together, just putting some of the texts describing the throne of God side by side. I found it very interesting and learned a lot, and I hope that you will too. So the areas that I've highlighted are the ones, those are my highlights. I've put Revelation chapter 4, Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel 10, and Isaiah 6 side by side for your ease of reference as well. In turquoise, it's a description of the sea of glass around God's throne and the different ways it gets described in the different texts. In orange, you find the creatures around the throne, or the beasts, or the actual throne of God described in various ways. And you'll see how John does it quite different from the others. Then right at the bottom right, there's the apocalypse of Abraham, one I told you about yesterday. That is a Jewish apocalypse, not a Christian apocalypse, from the end of the 1st century, written very much the same time as John's apocalypse. And just to highlight again what that says, let me just zoom in a bit. It's a very strange thing to read, but you'll see there it says, each one of the 4 living creatures had 4 faces. And then it says a little bit lower down that they actually have, in brackets, it says, so each of the 4 creatures had 16 faces. So it gets a little bit crazy. You can easily see why this didn't make it into either the Jewish or the Christian canon. But lower down where it gets very interesting, it says after verse 9, and when they had ended the singing, they looked at one another and threatened one another. And it came to pass, when the angel who was with me saw that they were threatening each other, he left me and went running to them and turned the countenance of each living creature from the countenance immediately confronting them, in order that they might not see their countenances threatening each other. And he taught them the song of the peace, which has its origin in the eternal one. Now, it sounds very bizarre, very strange, but this is just an example of some of the extra biblical material one can encounter. Sometimes they do cast light and provide us with additional background. In this case, I simply provide it as almost an oddity. Now, this morning we're going to talk about issues of interpretation. No surprise, there are issues of interpretation when it comes to the book of Revelation. Something I didn't mention yesterday, and that's quite important to realize, is that Revelation contains 184 direct quotations from the Old Testament, 34 from Daniel, 49 from Isaiah, 31 from Ezekiel, 21 from Exodus, 23 from the Psalms, 16 from Jeremiah, and 10 from Zechariah. Why am I saying this? It's just to remind us that it was assumed that the original recipients of the letters of Revelation and the entire book would be familiar with these passages. When they read about these images, when they read about the 2 witnesses, when they read about a beast rising from the ocean or from the land, or when they read about the 2 witnesses, these would be familiar images that they could draw on from Daniel or from Zechariah or even from Zephaniah. These were not strange things. Today, we need to do a lot more work to discover the origin of these and what connections they are with the Old Testament. And we'll just briefly touch on some of them today. I'm going to start off with 3 quotations from New Testament scholars. Some of them are quite heavy, and I'm just going to go briefly through them because they have been helpful to me, and you might later on want to refer to them as well. The first one is from Michael Gorman in his brilliant book, Reading Revelation Responsibly. He says that Revelation is primarily good news about Christ, the Lamb of God, who shares God's throne and who is the key to the past, the present, and the future, and therefore also about uncompromising faithfulness leading to undying hope, even in the midst of unrelenting evil and oppressive empire. You see, the basic function of the apocalyptic seems clear: to sustain the people of God, especially in times of crisis, particularly evil and oppression. Specifically, the revelation was written to remind a suffering and battered church that Christ was Lord. Our second quotation is from Theology of the New Testament by Schell. He says this brilliant. He says, the goal of apocalypse is not speculative foresight, but theological insight. Very dense quotation, but very true. And lastly, Timothy Johnson, in his book Writings, he says, few writings in all of literature have been so obsessively read with such generally disastrous results as the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. Its history of interpretation is largely a story of tragic misinterpretation resulting from a fundamental misapprehension of the work's literary form and purpose. Insofar as its arcane symbols have fed the treasury of prayer and poetry, its influence has been benign. More often, these same symbols have nurtured delusionary systems, both private and public, to the destruction of their fashioners and to the discredit of the writing. Now that's quite a mouthful, and it's very true what he says. Popular interpretations are very often misguided and do sometimes have tragic consequences in people's lives and in the fate of countries as a whole. One of the first questions that you can have when you turn to Revelation 2 and 3 and you read the letters is there one reward or many rewards? In this little paragraph here, which I snipped from a book, perhaps I should have done it at a slightly smaller scale. This is just a composition of all the promises to overcomers that you find in the letters. It says, to those who overcome, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. I will give you the crown of life. I will give you some of the hidden manna. I will give you a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. To those who overcome and do my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. I will also give you the morning star. Those who overcome will be dressed in white. I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will you leave it. I will write on you the name of my God and the name of my city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. I will write on you my new name. To those who overcome, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne. You read this and you think, wow, I'm getting all these things. But then you have to think, are these all literal? Will I really receive the morning star Will I be dressed in white? Will I be a pillar in the temple of my God? And you start thinking, well, maybe it's not that simple. Maybe the apocalyptic language already occurs in those very first 2 or 3 chapters of Revelation. And here's really the answer. Various images are used to visualize one reward. Now, these 2 slides come from a textbook, which I'll share 4 pages of with you after the class, so you can read the whole context of what is written here. And the author describes it beautifully. But he says here, the reward is deity and humanity in perfect unity. Us and God being perfectly united. Instead of God being in heaven, we will be with God and God will be with us. And all these images function in exactly the same way. And yes, we can interpret the white stone from archaeology, might mean this or might mean that, or we can have all kinds of significances attached to each of these rewards. And you'll find that very often in commentaries. And that's not wrong, but when we don't view it as a whole, we can miss the overall picture. What do these signify? These are not individual rewards. These actually signify the ultimate reward. Next question, something that I spoke about yesterday, is the visions in the book of Revelation. Are they concurrent or are they consecutive? In other words, do they occur one after the other? Or is it the same event just being described from different perspectives? And the answer is that very likely it's not a sequence of events. If one refers to other apocalypses, they often employed visions in a concurrent rather than a consecutive manner. So we find one basic story of judgment and salvation being told over and over again through visions that use different symbols or images to describe the same events. An example of that, you would find that the world appears to come to an end in Revelation 6. But in Revelation 8, there are still cataclysms that occur. In Revelation 7, God's righteous appeared to be gathered into heaven. But in Revelation 13, they are described as suffering persecution on earth. Then in Revelation 6, verse 13, you can read, the stars fall from the sky like figs. But in Revelation 8, verse 12, the stars are back up in the sky. And then in Revelation 12, verse 4, it says a third of the stars are again swept from the sky. Briefly, I'd like to discuss 5 systems of interpretation that are all quite common out there. The first system is a system called preterism. Preterism is just a word that means past, if I recall correctly from the Latin. The way it interprets Revelation 4 to 19, it sees the whole book of Revelation as describing a specific period in the church where it was locked in battle with Roman persecution, generally before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So it definitely sees the book of Revelation as having been written not in the 90s, but somewhere in the 50s or 60s, so very early on. Another approach that one could often find is historicism, where it sees that the whole book of Revelation is really an outline of the history of the church, from the apostolic church up to the present. So it describes major events. So you would find as you read the book of as you read Revelation 2 and 3, it doesn't actually, those churches actually, for example, signify the Reformation or the Catholic Church. It's actually quite strange, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Then the next system that is probably the most popular today is futurism. And the most common format of that is premillennialism. And that sees all of Revelation, or almost all of it, as future events, and as describing a future period before the second coming of Christ. Very often you'll hear terms like pre-tribulation and the Great Tribulation, and it sees the book of Revelation as describing great global upheavals that will take place before Jesus returns. The fourth way of reading Revelation is called idealism or amillennialism. And I would say that a large part of the world, I think most Protestants and definitely Catholics read Revelation that way, that it is a timeless book. It describes spiritual truths. Good will eventually prevail over evil. Readers are encouraged in their current trials. And the last one is called the eclectic approach. And that, I would say, is possibly the one that I myself are drawn to the most. But I'm not going to be prescriptive in this class. I'm going to give you guys some, let you make your own mind up. Now, we're just going to jump quickly into one of the systems that I just described, called the dispensationalist or historicist view of Revelation 2 and 3. It's still very popular today, and you might meet some friends on campus or in your family or in some churches that hold this view, but it's got no basis in the text, and it's got a huge bias, and it really is wildly speculative. And the next slide will tell you why. The way people have read this since the Middle Ages is to see the church in Ephesus, for example, as signifying the apostolic church, and Smyrna, because they were being persecuted, is a persecuted church, roughly from the year 100 to 312, when Constantine became emperor and became favorable towards the church. Then Pergamum is seen as a compromised church, favored by empire but judged by Christ, and so on. Now it gets quite strange at the end. For example, Philadelphia would be the true church, loved by Christ, characterized by revival and missionary activity. Now, this is roughly measured from 1750 to the 20th century. The first thing that you see, this was clearly written from a Western European and American perspective. The rest of the world does not really feature in this scheme, and it is highly subjective. There is no indication that the letters in Revelation in any way represent church ages or specific epochs of church history. So I've just included this as something for interest, something you might encounter, but possibly not. Now, this is where it gets interesting. What about our family of churches? I want to give you some brief history. All of the major eschatological belief systems have been present in the Stone Campbell movement. Now, some quick definitions here. Eschatology, if I haven't defined it already, it's the study or writings that have to do with last things or end time events. The Stone Campbell movement, that is just a short way of saying the Restoration movement that we sprouted from. Our family of churches came from that as well. With that, I include the International Churches of Christ, the Churches of Christ, the Independent Christian churches, and the Disciples of Christ. For example, this is more than 200 years ago, 250 years ago. Alexander Campbell was a post-millennialist, and Barton Stone was a historic premillennialist. What do I mean by that? Campbell believed that the church, through the restoration of the ancient order that he was leading, would help to usher in a literal millennium. the majority of members of the Stone Campbell movement and the Churches of Christ were probably post-millennialists or historic pre-millennialists up until the 20th century. In the 20th century, some became dispensational pre-millennialists, but these congregations were ousted from fellowship with the rest of the church, which became amillennial, which basically describes where we are today. Now, I know this sounds all very complicated, but what I'm really saying is that very early on in our movement, and I'm talking about more than 200 years ago, the founding members really did believe that the book of Revelation should be taken literally, that there would be a 1,000-year rule by the church, that Jesus would rule for 1,000 years, or that cataclysmic events would happen exactly as described in the Bible. On my next slide, I hope it will make it a little bit more clear. And this one I'll pause in a little bit. This is taken straight from Wikipedia, so I don't believe it really has any copyright issues. I've summarized there 4 of the main ways that Christians see the millennium, the 1,000-year rule that is described in the book of Revelation. The first one you find is post-tribulational premillennialism. It's also called historical premillennialism. And the reason it's called historical is because it's a very old system. Some of the church fathers taught this as well. The way they see this is that at some point after Jesus, there would be a tribulation, there would be a second coming of Jesus, then there would be a 1,000-year rule, and thereafter there would be the last judgment. Now, Barton Stone was one of the believers in this. This is one that I've always struggled to find my head around because of Jesus was going to rule for 1,000 years. It's very difficult to imagine that there would still be apostasy at the end of that, with a drastic judgment still after all of that. The second one is pre-dispensational premillennialism. This is one that became popular perhaps 100 years ago in a small section of our churches, and they slowly moved away. This is something that's very popular in evangelical circles. At some point after Jesus' first coming, there would be a second coming, and there might be a rapture before or after a period of tribulation. That's why rapture is in brackets there. Then there would be, Jesus would come again with the church to rule for 1,000 years. In other words, the saints would rule on the earth, and then there would be a last judgment. This is a very complex series of events, and dispensational premillennialists really divide themselves into pre-tribulationists, post-tribulationists, mid-tribulationists. It is actually quite chaotic if you try and investigate this. Then Alexander Campbell believed in post-millennialism. What that really means is that there would be a period of peace on earth because the church would evangelize the whole world, and governments would effectively become Christian and be converted, and there would be it would be as if Jesus ruled for like a 1,000-year golden age. Then there would be a second coming or a last judgment. This is a profoundly hopeful belief. Today, in our churches, we mostly believe in amillennialism, which means that we take the millennium in the book of Revelation as symbolic, as that Jesus is ruling right now. The Lamb is on the throne. And we, in a sense, do rule with him. We are kings and priests and daughters and sons of God right now. And I would say maybe 70, 80% of the Christian world have the amillennial view. And after that symbolic millennium, Jesus comes back as a final judgment, and with a final judgment. Now, again, what about our churches? Just a final note on that. I said we are amillennial, but maybe a better word would be to say that we are eclectic. And on this slide, I'm going to show you 3 views from teachers in our church. I'm not going to say who they are or give them specific references, but well, no, I will. It's Gordon Ferguson, Michael Burns, and Douglas Jacoby, but I won't say who said what. For example, one teacher within our churches identifies the beast rising from the earth in Revelation 13 as Jewish false prophets infiltrating the church, while another teaches that that is Rome. Then one teacher identifies the prostitute in Revelation 17 as Rome, while another identifies her as Jerusalem. One teacher proposes that the temporary release of Satan in Revelation 20 is a future event, while another teaches that this entire passage is figurative. The reason I show this to you is to show you that differing interpretations on specific passages in Revelation can coexist. It takes nothing away from the overall message of Revelation. And just something else, I did not get these from personal interviews with each of these teachers. This is from published books and study guides that each one of them produced that I've read through the past few years. And I just want to go briefly through some of the problems of the premillennial approach, the one that is the most popular in Hollywood and the Left Behind series and all kinds of movies that you might see about the rapture and the final days. It simplistically views biblical prophecy as history written in advance. It treats the Bible as a puzzle to be pieced together with various texts taken out of context and linked to current or expected events. It claims to be literal, but it is not really literal. It's only selectively so. It misunderstands the nature and function of apocalyptic literature. Very important. Prophetic does not merely mean predictive, and apocalyptic is heavily symbolic. It finds aspects of the second coming that are not in the Bible, such as 2 comings of Jesus and the rapture in Revelation, which simply is not there. It assumes we are on the brink of the rapture and Revelation, and this is all that matters. It also misunderstands New Testament references to the end times. For the New Testament, the end times is the entire period between the first and second comings of Jesus. Very importantly, it reduces the gospel to God and Jesus and the rapture and the glorious appearing, amounting to an unhealthy preoccupation with the details about events surrounding Christ's second coming. And very scary, it reduces the primary reason for conversion to fear. It effectively reduces discipleship to 4 things: faith in Jesus in order to avoid being left behind or destroyed, evangelizing others so they won't be left behind or destroyed. Thirdly, correlating Bible prophecy with current events. And finally, preparing to die or kill for the gospel or kingdom. Very, very scary. Now, the alternative that is truly the biblical reading, explained beautifully by Michael Gorman in Reading Revelation Responsibly. He says that we need to recognize that the central and centering image of Revelation is the Lamb that was slaughtered, the throne of God in Revelation 4 and 5. And that we need to remember that Revelation was first of all written by a first century Christian for first century Christians using first century literary devices and images. We need to abandon literal linear approaches to the book as if it were written, as if it were history written in advance. We need to focus on the book's call to public worship and discipleship. We need to place the images of death and destruction in Revelation within the larger framework of hope. Now, this comes from a recent commentary by Wendy L. Widder on the book of Daniel. She says that the Apostle John said many antichrists would come, and history has borne this out. There may yet be a specific worldwide figure who will accompany the final events of the end, though the ambiguity of the New Testament texts themselves should lead to caution and lack of dogmatic certainty. This kind of reserve is especially necessary with apocalyptic literature. Now, I just want to, here at the end, just talk briefly about the number of the beast. One of the many issues that people bring up when they talk about Revelation. What about the number 666? John Bright in the Kingdom of God says it beautifully. And I'll read it. This is on 2 slides. Revelation presents a picture such as only the language of Apocalypse could draw. Sober speech would never have sufficed. On one side are arrayed that old dragon, Satan, sorry, not Stan, his angels and his Antichrist, all the powers of evil, visible and invisible, on the earth and beyond it. The evil powers of earth seem to be personified in the figure of the unspeakable Nero, number 666, the beast. Yet, it is not merely Nero, nor Domitian, nor yet Hitler, or Stalin that is in question. It is any of them. It is all of them. None of them. It is all earthly powers, whoever and however many they may be, that subserve the will of the adversary, that have made themselves anti-God and anti-Christ. It is, if you will, eternal Nero, Nero redivivus, in other words, Nero revived, who walks the earth in many incarnations. It is a sum total of all evil, and it launches a last demonic assault upon the heavenly kingdom, the Lamb, the Son of Man, and him who sits upon the throne. It vents its wrath also with fiendish fury upon the saints of God who live on earth. For them, it is a time of decision. With the revelation of Christ, there has come also, as it must, the revelation of Antichrist, and one must stand for one side or the other. Lastly, just to summarize, the language of apocalyptic tends to be more elusive than precise, more impressionistic than realistic, and more fantastic than literal. Apocalyptic focuses on God's final solution as he brings about the conclusion of history. The language and symbolism transcends the historical events of the destruction of Jerusalem. They are sufficiently elusive to be reapplied to later situations. For example, the 2 beasts of Revelation 13 refer to Rome and the authorities that enforce emperor worship, respectively. Yet history has shown that terrible beasts have arisen time and time again and many of them in the last century. We can be assured of this. God deals decisively with the idolatry and injustice of empires. One thing I'd just like to mention here, because I briefly mentioned this on the last slide, when we talk about the imagery of beasts in Revelation 13, for example, this is not an image we can understand unless we as readers are familiar with the book of Daniel, where we recognize that beasts are used symbolically to indicate powerful empires. And we cannot really understand what a beast would be that's rising out of the sea that threatens these 7 churches unless we understand where these 7 churches were located in Western Turkey. And then suddenly it makes sense from their perspective. Rising from the sea would be the Roman armies invading them and constantly coming, threatening them. And then it suddenly starts making sense. The beast rising from the land, that is empowered by the beast rising from the sea, enforcing worship of the beast. Then suddenly, in the context of 1st century enforced emperor worship, all these things do start to make sense. If we read in context, then the throne scene in Revelation 4 and 5 starts to make more sense as well, because it is a little bit different from what we read in Ezekiel and elsewhere. We don't immediately read about him who is on the throne. The scene is first set. We are told about a dazzling throne. Then we are told about 24 elders or kings around the throne. You know, the number 24 is not one I explained earlier, and the reason is because it doesn't really occur in the Old Testament. We can try, and interpreters generally try and say, well, it probably represents all of God's faithful. In other words, the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. Now, that is a sensible approach. But imagine from a 1st century reader's perspective. Surprisingly, Domitian was the first one who increased his number of guards, or what they call lictors, from 12 to 24. So if we took this as a dramatic reading, which it was intended to be, it is very likely that the first listeners would not have immediately, they would have heard the description of a heavenly throne room, which is the way that the emperors described themselves. They saw themselves as gods worthy of worship. And then there's a description of what seems like Domitian's throne room. But then there's a surprise twist that it's not Domitian on the throne, it is the Lamb on the throne. And that, to me, when I read the book of Revelation, is an image that I cannot get out of my head. It is amazing, and it brings it alive to me as well. And I'm not saying that is the correct reading, but it's something that is really worth considering and maybe will be helpful to you as well. Thank you very much.